When the history of America comes to mind, most people expect stories about the fight for independence, liberation, World War II, the American Revolution, and so many other historical events. But that's not all. America today is the most powerful country on the planet, no doubt about that. But it has a lot of sad histories. One such history is the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where American natives were ordered to be killed and slaughtered by American soldiers. This tragic event in the history of Native Americans exposes a painful reality that deserves our attention. Join us as we unveil the untold, bringing to light a piece of history that has long been kept in the shadows. As you watch this video, help us hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and remember to turn on your notification bell. Before we unravel the mystery and tell the stories behind one of the darkest chapters in the United States history, let's take a look at the events leading to these alleged genocides against the American natives. The Treaty of Fort Laramie is what opens the chapter to the infamous Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. Most Native Americans, before the colonists and Western settlers came, had no proper knowledge about the system of land ownership. Years after a conflict between fellow native tribes and colonists ensued, the very powerful colonists had all they wanted using force, but it never yielded any fruit. Instead, it resulted in conflicts and bred hate for them among the American tribes. So in 1851, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed and created boundaries for different native tribes, including the Arapaho and the Cheyenne. What was described to end the land dispute in America failed to provide a solution. Tension grew as the European settlers continued their expansionist agenda, encroaching on lands belonging to the natives. The Pikes Peak Gold Rush of 1858 prompted a large number of Europeans to move to Colorado, which intensified the conflicts, struggle, and competition for resources. 6 Southern Cheyenne and 4 Arapaho chiefs signed the Treaty of Fort Wise with the United States on February 18, 1861, giving up much of the territory that the Fort Laramie Treaty had awarded to them. Black Kettle, White Antelope, Lean Bear, Little Wolf and Tall Bear were among the Cheyenne leaders. Little Raven, Storm, Shavehead, Big Mouth, and Nawat, or Left Hand, were among the Arapaho chiefs. The chiefs who signed the pact were scorned by the Cheyenne warriors, who even threatened to kill them if they tried to implement its terms. The new reserve was situated in eastern Colorado, between the Arkansas River and Sand Creek, and accounted for less than 1/13 of the land acknowledged in the 1851 treaty. The majority of Cheyenne bands, such as the militaristic Dog Soldiers, who were formed in the late 1830s by Cheyenne and Lakota, were upset with the chiefs who had signed the pact. They refused to follow restrictions and renounced the treaty, which was never approved by the Council of 44, the highest tribe authority. They carried on with their lives, hunting in the bison-rich areas of western Kansas and eastern Colorado, and growing more hostile toward the wave of white settlers that crossed their territory. In particular, tensions were high in Kansas' Smoky Hill River area, where white settlers had blazed a fresh path to the gold mines. The Cheyenne, who were against the treaty, said that a tiny group of the tribe's leaders had signed it without the agreement of the majority, that the signatories were duped into signing it by giving out a lot of presents, and that they did not. Realizing what they were doing, authorities adopted the stance that non-compliant Indians were antagonistic and plotting a conflict. In 1861, the Cheyenne began perpetrating small crimes. These crimes remained unpunished and grew as a result. Agent Laurie encouraged Governor John Evans to treat the Cheyenne again in 1863 because of their intense desire for war. Governor Evans went out as scheduled to meet with the chiefs, but they failed to appear at the designated location. Elbridge Gerry, the governor's guide, was dispatched to attempt to locate the chiefs. 2 weeks later, Jerry came back to report that the chiefs had convened a council and had chosen not to meet with Governor Evans. The governor accepted Bullbeer's invitation to meet, but his troops refused. Word spread that a coalition of Plains tribes was to be formed to drive the whites between the end of 1863 and the beginning of 1864. The Sioux, Comanches, Kiowas, Cheyennes, and Arapahos were actively fighting each other in the spring and summer of 1864. This resulted in the deaths of many civilians, the destruction of livestock and crops, the cutting off of supplies to the area, and the risk of starvation or death at the hands of the Plains tribes for the Colorado settler. Without attempting to negotiate a truce or engage in dialogue, soldiers from the 1st Colorado Cavalry Regiment ambushed Cheyennes in the vicinity of Fraser's Orchard. A herdsman working for Irving, Jackman and Company reported on April 13 that Cheyennes and Arapahos had driven out of their camp south of Denver 60 oxen and 12 horses and mules. George Bent, the herdsman, was a man of both Cheyenne and white descent who lived through the Sand Creek Massacre that followed. Bent Aziad, some Cheyennes from one of these camps, were out hunting one day in April when they noticed a herd of oxen wandering around amid the sandhills. They transported the animals to camp, since they weren't sure who owned them, to hold on to them until someone could claim them. Since there were lots of buffalo on that range that winter, the Indians had little need for the oxen and would never consume tame meat when they could acquire buffalo. To reclaim the animals, Lieutenant Clark Dunn dispatched a small group of troops. 4 of the soldiers lost their lives in the subsequent battle, and the tribes kept the cattle they had taken. Lieutenant George Ear was also dispatched to locate the cattle and demand their return. Ear planned to assault the camp if they refused to surrender the animal. When word reached Ear's group that Crow Chief's party was approaching, they abandoned their 70 lodge camp, which they had destroyed and looted without adhering to the command to first parley. Then Ear's men discovered, looted, and set fire to Chief Coon's band's camp, which Coon's band had also abandoned when their scouts warned them of Ear's impending arrival. Lean Bear, Black Kettle, and other members of the tribe were camped on their buffalo hunting grounds near Ash Creek on May 16th, less than 15 months after they had seen President Lincoln in Washington. Lieutenant George Ear of the 1st Colorado Regiment advanced on the group. Lean Bear went to meet the militia by himself to demonstrate his benign intentions, confident that this would be a friendly encounter. Lean Bear proudly displayed his peace medal on his breast, which he had won on his 1863 visit to Washington, D.C. He carried an official document bearing Lincoln's signature, declaring that he was cordial and peaceful with white people. Lean Bear was unaware that Colonel John N. Shivington had given instructions for Ear's forces to kill Cheyennes whenever and wherever found. Lean Bear was injured and tumbled from his horse, so Ear gave his troops the order to shoot him. The troops then rode past his corpse and shot him many times. Books and newspaper articles from the period describe how, in the summer of 1864, Cheyenne warriors assaulted settlers and carried out several crimes, including the Hunget Massacre on June 11. The formation of armed troops in Colorado Territory resulted from the start of the American Civil War in 1861. However, the federal government's focus remained solidly on defeating the Confederates. Consequently, the area's supply of wagons, wagon trains, settlers, villages, and communication connections were all largely unprotected by the military. By the summer of 1864, attacks were occurring almost daily on stages. Immigrants were being cut off, and raids were occurring on villages. The pioneers started fleeing to larger towns, like Denver, after abandoning their ranches and farms. On August 8, 1864, a concerted attack was launched against every stage line that was in place in the area. John Evans was appointed the second governor of Colorado in 1861 by President Abraham Lincoln in a bid to calm the situation indefinitely, but it did not. In the preceding year, a war broke out in Colorado which was referred to as Cheyenne War. The same issue happened again, land disputes among the natives and with the European settlers. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was broken and conflict ensued. Evans, as Colorado's governor, tried different approaches to resolve the conflicts, called for the intervention of the federal government, held talks with the tribespeople, and established different camps until 1864. But all efforts proved abortive. The result of Evans' effort to restore peace to Colorado and settle the conflict between the European settlers and the natives, and between natives and natives, was believed to be what led to the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. The Sand Creek Massacre. On the morning of November 29th, 1864, the American native chiefs of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, Chief Black Kettle, Big Man, Yellow Wolf, War Bonnet, Bear Man, One Eye, Spotted Crow, and a few other chiefs, including Graybeard, also known as Wolf Gray, and Little Bear, camped at a big sand creek about 40 miles north of Fort Leon. With these chiefs were also camped about 750 tribesmen, women and children of the Arapaho and the Cheyenne Native American. For that very moment, the people were still having land disputes with their fellow natives and the white settlers, who limited them to a very tiny portion of land they used for hunting on their lands. The Arapaho and Cheyenne suffered a great deal from these expandist agendas by the white colonists that invaded their land. In a bid to pursue peace and ensure the safety of their people, after many years of boundary dispute with other Native Americans and Western settlers, expatriates who had been brutally mistreating, the people's efforts were put to achieve the Treaty of Fort Laramie, an agreement that was hoped to be the only way to attain peace and some sort of freedom from the whites. The treaty was meant to discuss how much land would be allocated in the Great Plains to these two native tribes, to allow them land for living, and of course their hunting practice, which was their main occupation before the arrival of the Europeans. In an event that would later turn into tragedy, Governor of Colorado John Evans proclaimed at the beginning of summer 1864, and commanded all friendly Native Americans of the Cheyenne and Arapaho ethnicity to assemble at Fort Leon for safety and to receive supplies. As things would later turn, a standing order was issued to massacre any American natives seen approaching the fort. In a move to save his people from the brutality of the colonists' military, Chief Black Kettle of the Cheyenne tribe attempted to reach an agreement, and therefore reached Major Wynkoop at the fort in Lyon. Black Kettle's hope rested on the idea that should these be successful, his tribe's people and those of the Arapaho could start a new life of freedom in which they were living before the European settlers entered their lands. However, the aggressiveness and brutality that melted on Native Americans during that period made his heart pump faster, and he was filled with fear that the settlers might do something even more terrible. Every iota of hope started turning blurry as he failed to negotiate peace with Governor Evans, Edward Wynkoop, and Colonel Chivington. Evans then commanded Wynkoop to issue out the instruction concerning where the Arapaho and the Cheyenne should stay, while the discussion was still being discussed until an agreement was reached, and they were allocated some plains. So he commanded that they all stay at a location near Fort Leon until the negotiation was finalized. In the hopes of a positive outcome from the ongoing negotiation, Black Kettle settled with his people, numbering about 750 Arapaho and Cheyenne, which included mostly elderly people, women, and small children, around a big sandy creek. From Fort Leon, Wynkoop command, the encampment was in preparation to move to Fort Leon at the moment, so they could find safety and wait for supplies from the military, as promised by the governor. On that tragic November morning, at around 6:30 in the morning, the American soldiers of the element of 1st Colorado Infantry Regiment, volunteers, and the 2nd Colorado Cavalry Volunteers of the United States military, headed by Colonel Chivington, showed up from the southwest of the Sand Creek, where the Arapaho and Cheyenne were camped. Chivington was given the order not to leave Denver at the moment until the deed was done. Around 630, when the natives were just waking up, the soldiers opened fire on the unaware Cheyenne and Arapaho civilians, scattering the entire camp with bullets and spilling blood. Luckily, many Cheyenne and Arapaho survived, but about 230 natives were massacred in cold blood that very day. Sadly, the victims, which were composed of the elderly, women, and children, did not only die. Numerous atrocities were perpetrated by the evil soldiers on their corpses. Instead of leaving the dead to rest, some reports even reported that the bodies of the victims were mutilated, and they removed certain body parts of some of the deceased as souvenirs. The soldiers, after this deadly killing, wandered around the Sand Creeks, meeting other evils, until they left on the 1st of December. Chivington later reported the attack, claiming victory over hostile Native Americans. That the truth came out after the United States government made some investigations, which would later unfold all the mysteries surrounding this dark event. It was considered a genocide by the people, but Chivington didn't see it that way. In fact, he was never prosecuted for championing these genocidal acts against the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, though his career suffered a great deal and ended in disgrace. Following the Sand Creek attack, the U.S. Congress conducted a series of investigations to determine what caused the event, to gather evidence against the perpetrators, and to determine if it was self-defense, as they claimed. And in 1865, a joint committee on the conduct of war, which was a congressional panel, launched an investigation and declared the massacre foul and dastardly, and not a military engagement, as Chivington had claimed. The U.S. Army also conducted its investigations, led by Major General Samuel Ryan Curtis, and provided several reports and outcomes condemning Chivington and his men. As the news of the terror spread, the public criticized Chivington and Evans, and it damaged their reputation, and they had to live with trauma till the end of their lives. In action to prevent the reoccurrence of such a dark history, the government made a policy change that was geared toward fostering peace and good relations between the European settlers, the natives, and itself. President Ulysses Grant's peace policy. The policy was aimed at promoting peace in America, especially among the natives. Unfortunately, none of the perpetrators were brought to book. Chivington only had to deal with criticism and not persecution for the grievous crime against unarmed civilians. Governor Evans, on the other hand, who was believed to have ordered Chivington to carry out the attack, was only criticized for the attack, and to date he has never been convicted of having any involvement with the attack or of ordering Chivington. Following the pursuit to establish peace and calm the aftermath of the brutal massacre, the Medicine Lodge Treaty was signed in 1867. The treaty was in particular between tribes of the Southern Plain, which also included the Arapaho and Cheyenne ethnicities, and the U.S. government. The treaty was specifically designed to solve issues arising from land sharing and border disputes among the natives. The tribes were offered new reservation land in present-day Oklahoma. Despite not receiving adequate punishment for the senseless bloodshed, Colonel John Chivington died in 1865 disgracefully. His career in government, politics, and the military before his death ended completely in shame. Since it was hard to convict Evans, and the criticism was growing hard among the natives and the general populace, he was removed from office as the governor of Colorado. This sad event made an indelible mark in the history of the United States, signifying the brutality and persecution the American natives suffered at the hands of the government and Western settlers. The Sand Creek killing was not only one of the highest forms of evil to be melted out on civilians, but also created a permanent scar in the lives and histories of the Arapaho and Cheyenne natives, as well as the other Native American tribes. Trauma from the terrifying incidents set a lot of boundaries and created massive grief. The surviving natives of the two tribes were also mandated to leave their home. These poor civilians had to rebuild their lives from scratch again, now in a place away from home. The U.S. government tried all it could to condone the people, but it never worked. One life cannot be restored, not to mention the over 200 able-bodied men, women, and children whose only crime was fighting over their native land. The Arapaho and Cheyenne lost trust completely in the U.S. government, and it birthed a sense of betrayal and disbelief in the government, which shattered further negotiations for peace. The entire native tribes of America were affected by the event. It got worse, to the extent that everyone was determined to avenge the brutality. The violence against Native Americans had been on for a long time, and it was overlooked for decades. Most of the European settlers saw the native people as less human, or not worthy of any respect or dignity. The Sand Creek Massacre brought everything out of the dark, and brought about a little change in the mindset and maltreatment of the people. Some of the Europeans then saw it as an act of self-defense. All these untrue claims were debunked by some of the soldiers who witnessed the tragic incident and were moved by their conscience to spill the truth. According to Captain Silas Soule, in his 1865 letter to the United States Congress, he said, "Hundreds of women and children were coming towards us and went on their knees to beg for mercy, only to be shot one by one and have their brains beaten out by soldiers claiming to be the civilized ones." Fast forward to over 100 years after the massacre, in Denver in 2000, some manuscripts composed of letters by Lieutenant Joseph and Captain Silas Soule were also. These papers gave well-detailed accounts of the massacre, exploding the barbarism surrounding the event. It also showed that more than 100 soldiers defied the order to perpetuate the attack on the innocent Cheyenne and Arapaho. In 2007, the U.S. government took action to mortalize those Arapaho and the Cheyenne that died in the Sand Creeks and created a national historic site in honor of both the victims and the survivors, as well as educating Americans on the occurrence. The event. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, drop a thumbs up and subscribe for more informative content like this. See you in our next video.